Tonight, we are talking about when people first started smoking weed. And as it turns out, this is not a modern story at all, not even close. It is a story that begins thousands of years ago, long before modern cities, long before awkward political debates, and long before anyone thought to turn it into a business opportunity, because, of course, we would eventually do that. If we drift far enough back, we arrive in ancient Central Asia, where wild cannabis plants grew quietly across open landscapes, just minding their own business, not asking for attention, not expecting to become one of the most discussed plants in human history. But people noticed them eventually. Humans always notice plants, especially the ones that do something a little extra.
Look, these leaves
At
are so
first,
vibrant.
cannabis was not
Indeed.
really
And
about
see the
relaxing or escaping
must be
anything.
good to eat.
It was
I'll
practical,
gather some for
which
us.
feels very human.
Fine harvest.
People rarely jump straight to leisure. They usually start with survival. Ancient communities used hemp fibers from the cannabis plant to make rope, cloth, and even early forms of paper. It was strong, reliable, and honestly a bit of an overachiever as far as plants go. But at some point, and it is always some point, someone decided to try burning it and breathing in the smoke. And this is where things start to get quietly interesting. Archaeologists have found evidence in places like ancient burial sites in what is now Western China, where people burned cannabis in wooden braziers during rituals and ceremonies. The air would fill with smoke, and whatever followed likely felt meaningful or calming, or perhaps just a little unusual, which was probably enough to keep the practice going. These were not casual weekend activities. These were moments tied to spirituality, to communication with something beyond everyday life. So in a way, the earliest smoking of cannabis was less about relaxation and more about connection, though of course feeling relaxed probably did not hurt. Now, if we gently move westward, we arrive in the world of the Scythians, who were nomadic groups described by the Greek historian Herodotus, who always seemed both fascinated and slightly confused by the people he wrote about, which is fair, because they did have some unique habits. He described how the Scythians would throw cannabis seeds onto hot stones inside small enclosed spaces, creating thick clouds of smoke, and then they would sit inside and inhale it all, very calmly, as if this was completely normal, which to them it was. He even noted that they would shout with joy, which suggests they were having a reasonably good time. This might be one of the earliest recorded descriptions of something that looks a lot like recreational use, though it still carried ritual significance, so it wasn't exactly casual, but it was also not entirely serious. It existed somewhere in between, which feels like a theme that will follow cannabis throughout history. As time moves on, we drift into ancient India, where cannabis takes on a slightly more structured role within culture and religion. It becomes associated with spiritual practices, particularly within certain traditions of Hinduism, where it's linked to the god Shiva, who was said to have a fondness for the plant. In this context, cannabis was often consumed as a drink called bhang, which was made by grinding the leaves into a paste and mixing it with milk and spices, which sounds surprisingly refined considering how old the practice is. This was not hidden or controversial. It was accepted, even celebrated in certain festivals where people would gather, drink bhang, and enter a state of calm reflection or gentle euphoria, which again sounds like a fairly pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Meanwhile, in ancient China, cannabis continued to exist mostly as a practical plant used in medicine and textiles, though there are records suggesting it was occasionally used for its mind-altering effects, particularly by shamans who used it during rituals, which seems to be a recurring theme across cultures. It's almost as if humans across different parts of the world independently reached the same quiet conclusion, that this plant could do more than just sit there looking leafy. As we slowly move into the Middle East, cannabis takes on another identity here. Here it becomes known as hashish, which is made from the resin of the plant and is often consumed in different ways, including smoking and eating. During the medieval period, hashish was used in various social settings, sometimes among intellectual circles and sometimes among groups who were perhaps just looking for a break from the pressures of daily life, which even back then were very real, despite the absence of emails and deadlines. There are stories, though they may be slightly exaggerated, about groups like the so-called Hashashin, who were rumored to use hashish, though historians debate how accurate those claims really are, because medieval storytelling was not always concerned with strict accuracy. It was more about drama and memorable details. Still, the idea persisted, and cannabis became wrapped in a mix of curiosity, fascination, and occasional suspicion depending on who was writing about it, which again feels very familiar. If we continue drifting forward, we reach early modern Europe, where cannabis had a much quieter presence. It was still used mainly for hemp production and medicinal purposes, and while some people were aware of its other effects, it wasn't a central part of everyday life, at least not in the same visible way as in other regions. This changes gradually as global trade expands and ideas begin to move more freely across continents, bringing with them new habits, new substances, and new ways of thinking about relaxation and medicine. By the time we reach the 19th century, cannabis begins to appear more openly in Western medical texts. Doctors experiment with it as a treatment for various conditions, including pain, insomnia, and anxiety, which suggests that even then people were looking for ways to soften the edges of daily life. It was often taken in tinctures rather than smoked, which feels very on brand for the time. Everything was either a tincture or a very serious-looking powder stored in a small glass bottle. And, of course, as with many things, once something becomes more widely known, it also becomes more complicated. Attitudes shift, regulations appear, and what was once a quiet background presence starts to move into the spotlight. But we'll take our time getting there, because there's no need to rush. History rarely does anything quickly, despite what timelines might suggest. Instead, we can pause here for a moment and notice how consistent the human experience has been across centuries. People worked, they worried, they searched for meaning, and occasionally they found small ways to step outside of it all, whether through rituals, drinks, smoke, or simply sitting quietly and letting time pass. Cannabis was just happened to be one of those small discoveries, one that followed humanity across continents, adapting to different cultures, different beliefs, and different expectations, while always remaining essentially the same unassuming plant, growing quietly wherever it could. And there's something oddly comforting about that. The idea that even thousands of years ago, people weren't so different from us. They were curious, they experimented, they sometimes made questionable decisions, and occasionally they found something that made the world feel a little softer around the edges. So as we continue this slow journey through history, we'll meet more figures, more cultures, and more quietly strange habits that remind us that humans have always been searching, not for excitement, but for balance, for calm, for something to take the weight off their thoughts, even just for a moment. And with that gentle thought, we can drift a little further forward, letting the story unfold at its own pace, as it always does. As we continue drifting forward through time, the story of cannabis does what most long-lasting human habits tend to do. It quietly spreads, it changes shape depending on where it lands, and it slowly becomes part of everyday life in ways that no one fully plans. By the time we move into the later medieval and early modern periods, the plant has already traveled across trade routes that connected vast regions from Asia to the Middle East and into parts of Africa and Europe. These were not fast journeys. Nothing about history moves quickly, despite what timelines try to suggest. Instead, ideas and plants moved at the speed of caravans, at the pace of ships carried by wind and patience. Merchants carried spices, fabrics, stories, and occasionally something a bit more interesting tucked away among ordinary goods, and cannabis was one of those travelers. It did not announce itself loudly. It simply arrived, adapted, and settled in like a guest who never quite leaves. In the Islamic world during the medieval period, hashish becomes more visible in certain social and cultural spaces, though not always officially approved, which creates that familiar human situation where something is both quietly common and publicly discouraged at the same time, which of course only makes it more interesting. Writers and poets in places like Cairo and Baghdad sometimes mentioned hashish in ways that felt almost casual, as if it were just another part of life, something to be referenced without too much explanation, though occasionally there were moral debates about its use, because societies tend to do that. They notice something enjoyable, and then immediately begin discussing whether it should be allowed. And so, cannabis begins to carry not just physical effects, but also a kind of social weight. It becomes something people have opinions about, which might be one of the most predictable developments in human history. If we gently shift our attention westward into Africa, we find cannabis taking root in different regions, often blending into local traditions and daily routines. In some areas, it was used in spiritual practices, while in others it became part of more ordinary social settings, shared among small groups in quiet moments. There's a certain pattern emerging here, one that repeats across continents. People discover the plant, they experiment with it, they attach meaning to it, and then they settle into a rhythm where it becomes simply another option among many ways to pass time or seek comfort. Now, as we slowly enter the age of exploration, which sounds dramatic, but often involved a great deal of waiting and seasickness, European travelers begin encountering cannabis more directly in the places they visit, and they bring back descriptions that range from curious to slightly confused, which again feels very on-brand. Some describe its effects in medical terms. Others approach it with a kind of cautious fascination, as if they're not entirely sure what to make of it, but feel compelled to write something down anyway, because that is what scholars tend to do. By the 18th and 19th centuries, cannabis finds a more formal place within Western medicine, and this is where things take on a slightly more structured tone. Doctors begin studying it, experimenting with its use, and documenting its effects in ways that feel almost methodical, though still a bit uncertain. One of the more notable figures in this period is William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who worked in British India and took a particular interest in cannabis as a medical treatment. He observed its use in local traditions and decided to investigate it further, which was both practical and quietly adventurous in a scholarly sort of way. He conducted experiments, documented outcomes, and introduced cannabis-based treatments to Western medicine, suggesting it could help with pain, muscle spasms, and even certain neurological conditions, which at the time must have felt like discovering a rather versatile tool hidden in plain sight. And for a while it was accepted. Tinctures, extracts, and various preparations appeared in pharmacies and medical texts. It was prescribed with a level of calm professionalism that might seem surprising today, considering how the conversation around cannabis would later evolve. Patients would take small, measured doses, often in liquid form, and experience relief or at least some change in their condition, though the exact effects could vary because the plant does not always behave in a perfectly predictable way, which is something doctors then and now have had to navigate. At the same time, cannabis begins to appear in more social settings, particularly in parts of Europe where intellectual circles show a mild interest in its effects, not in a chaotic or rebellious way, but in a thoughtful, almost experimental manner. In places like Paris, small groups would gather to explore altered states of consciousness, often in controlled environments, discussing philosophy, literature, and perception, which sounds both very serious and quietly amusing at the same time. One such group was known as Le Club des Hachishens, which included writers and artists who were curious about how substances like hashish might influence creativity and thought processes. And while the name sounds dramatic, their gatherings were often quite calm, reflective, and somewhat introspective rather than wild or unpredictable. Among those associated with these circles was Charles Baudelaire, who wrote about his experiences with hashish in a tone that was more analytical than enthusiastic, noting both its effects and its limitations, which suggests that even in moments of experimentation, there was still a sense of careful observation. This period gives cannabis an unusual dual identity. It's both a medical substance and a subject of intellectual curiosity, existing somewhere between science and philosophy, without fully belonging to either. And as always happens when something occupies that kind of space, opinions begin to diverge. Some see it as useful, Others see it as unnecessary, and a few simply see it as mildly interesting but not worth too much attention. As we move toward the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the tone begins to shift, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Attitudes become more cautious, regulations start to appear, and what was once a relatively unremarkable substance begins to attract a different kind of scrutiny. This is not unique to cannabis. It happens with many things. Coffee, tea, tobacco, even sugar at various points in history have all been praised, questioned, regulated, and occasionally misunderstood because humans tend to cycle through phases of enthusiasm and concern. Cannabis, however, finds itself entering a particularly complex phase, especially in the United States, where changing social and political factors begin to shape how it's perceived and discussed. But rather than rushing into that shift, we can take a moment to linger in this quieter period, where the plant existed in a kind of balanced state, not entirely controversial, not entirely ordinary, simply present. Doctors prescribed it, scholars studied it, small groups experimented with it, and for many people it remained something distant, something they had heard of but not necessarily experienced, which is often how these things exist before they become widely known. There's something almost peaceful about this stage in its history, before debates grow louder, before policies become stricter, before the plant moves from the background into the center of attention. It's just there, growing quietly, being used in measured ways, drifting from one culture to another, adapting without much resistance. And if we listen closely to this moment in time, it feels slow, steady, almost uneventful in the best way possible, like a long afternoon where nothing urgent happens, and yet everything continues to move forward. So, as we keep floating along this timeline, we begin to sense that change is coming, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, as it always does, carried by shifts in society, by new ideas, by misunderstandings, and by the simple human tendency to rethink things that were once taken for granted. And somewhere ahead, the story will become more complicated, more layered, and perhaps a little more ironic, because history has a quiet sense of humor, and it often reveals that what people once accepted without question can later become the subject of endless discussion. But for now, we remain in this calm space, where cannabis is simply part of the background of human life, one small thread in a much larger tapestry woven from countless habits, discoveries, and gentle curiosities. And with that, we can continue drifting forward, letting the next chapter of this long, slow story unfold just as softly as everything that came before it. As we continue drifting forward, the story of cannabis begins to stretch across oceans, carrying with it both practical uses and subtle curiosities. It moves along with sailors, merchants, and explorers, quietly hitching rides in barrels and bales, unnoticed by many, but carefully noted by a few. By the 19th century, the plant had already established a presence in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Europe, and it was now slowly beginning to appear in the Americas. The introduction was not sudden, it was gradual, carried by colonial expansion and the slow mixing of cultures in port cities. People arrived with seeds, leaves, and stories, and local populations observed, experimented, and adapted. Cannabis found itself in new soil, new climates, and new social contexts, always adapting, never asking permission. In the Caribbean, for example, enslaved Africans brought knowledge of cannabis from their homelands. It was sometimes used medicinally and sometimes ritually. In Jamaica, over generations, it became integrated into social and spiritual practices, forming a quiet but resilient thread in the cultural fabric. These early uses were not flashy, they were measured, private, and deeply human, people seeking small ways to soften the edges of life, to find brief reprieve from labor, oppression, and monotony. Meanwhile, in North America, cannabis remained largely obscure for most of the 19th century, It existed in pharmacies, in medical texts, and in experimental tinctures sold for pain, insomnia, or mild anxiety. Physicians often recommended it in doses measured with precision, in bottles labeled with their best attempt at professionalism. Patients would follow the directions exactly, sometimes noticing effects and sometimes noticing nothing at all. This was ordinary life, structured, calm, and quiet, though occasionally tinged with curiosity about what this plant could do. One interesting figure during this period was William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician working in India. He meticulously studied the local uses of cannabis, observing how people incorporated it into medicine and daily life. When he returned to England, he published detailed accounts of his findings, advocating for cannabis's usefulness in treating conditions such as muscle spasms and pain. O'Shaughnessy approached the subject scientifically, with curiosity and careful observation, noting both successes and limitations. In his calm, precise way, he helped introduce the plant to a wider Western audience without fanfare or sensationalism, though, of course, history would later complicate his contribution. By the late 1800s, Western interest in cannabis expanded slowly but steadily. Pharmacists included it in compendiums, experimental societies tested its effects, doctors prescribed it in measured doses. Some patients found relief, some found little effect, and some were perhaps charmed by the novelty of it. It was never a flashy or dangerous obsession at this point. It was just there quietly, like a reliable companion in the background of modernizing life. At the same time, literary and artistic circles in Europe began to explore cannabis with a mixture of curiosity and experimentation. In Paris, the Club de Hachechines gathered small groups of writers, artists, and thinkers who were quietly interested in what hashish could do for perception, creativity, or reflection. Charles Baudelaire, a prominent member, documented his experiences with careful observation, noting the altered states it could produce while remaining measured and contemplative. These gatherings were calm, almost ritualistic, a kind of intellectual medication rather than a wild party. The dual identity of cannabis, both medical and mildly recreational, persisted across the Atlantic. In the United States, doctors prescribed it in tinctures and extracts, while curious intellectuals explored its effects quietly in private salons or scholarly circles. Meanwhile, ordinary people were largely unaware or unbothered, continuing with their daily routines, occasional experimentation, and measured curiosity. Yet, even in this calm period, subtle social judgments began to creep in. Cannabis became associated with marginalized groups, with immigrants or laborers, or with the occasional eccentric scholar. It was quietly observed, sometimes criticized, and sometimes ignored altogether. This pattern, normalization alongside suspicion, is one that repeats throughout history and will continue in later centuries. Humans have a consistent tendency to notice something enjoyable and then debate whether it should be allowed, documented, or controlled. By the early 20th century, cannabis remained widely available in medical contexts. It was prescribed for pain, nausea, and insomnia, sold in pharmacies alongside other tinctures, and quietly noted in medical journals. It had not yet become a major cultural flashpoint, though there were signs of creeping curiosity, concern, and mild controversy in certain social circles. In this period, the plant also became entwined with immigration and cultural exchange. Cannabis use by Mexican laborers in the southwestern United States became a subject of quiet attention in local newspapers and police reports, sometimes exaggerated for effect. These early reports often focused on minor misbehavior or unusual social habits, rarely noting that the plant itself was largely benign in the ways people actually used it. History, as it turns out, is always selective in what it chooses to emphasize. And so, cannabis continued to exist in a kind of liminal space, practical, mildly intriguing, quietly integrated, and occasionally whispered about. It was a companion to work, a gentle relief from pain, a subtle tool for reflection, and sometimes a topic of mild social scrutiny. In every case, it was humans who defined its role, shaping it to fit into the rhythms of life, ceremony, and curiosity. Meanwhile, in Europe, medicinal use of cannabis continued steadily. Pharmacists experimented with different extracts, physicians observed effects carefully, journals documented findings. There was no rush, no sensationalism, just a slow accumulation of knowledge and experience. Cannabis moved across borders quietly, always present, always adaptable, yet never truly commanding attention beyond small circles of users and scholars. In Asia, traditional uses persisted alongside this Western expansion. In India, bhang remained a cultural staple, integrated into festivals and spiritual practices. Its ritualized consumption provided a gentle balance between social life, spirituality, and personal reflection. Across the continent, people maintained the quiet, structured ways of incorporating cannabis into daily routines, showing a continuity of use that stretched back thousands of years. By the 20s and 30s, attitudes towards cannabis began to shift more noticeably. Internationally, governments began to codify regulations, sometimes out of mild concern, sometimes out of social prejudice, and occasionally simply to assert authority over unfamiliar cultural practices. Cannabis, once a quietly observed plant, began to appear in legal texts, newspapers, and early social commentary. Yet in everyday life, many people continued using it in measured, private, or medical contexts with little fuss or drama. This is a good moment to pause and reflect on the consistent human pattern revealed here. Cannabis travels across oceans and continents, adapts to local culture, is observed and experimented with, sometimes celebrated, sometimes discouraged, but always integrated into life in a quiet, measured way. It is a testament to the slow persistence of human curiosity and the understated ways that culture, medicine, and habit intersect over centuries. And with that thought, we can continue drifting into the mid-20th century, a time when the plant will encounter louder voices, changing laws, and cultural transformations that begin to shift its role in society more dramatically. But even as these changes approach, the story is still one of slow, human-scale discovery, adaptation, and reflection, the kind of narrative that allows us to settle deeper into our cushions, take another slow breath, and appreciate the subtle rhythms of history unfolding. As we drift forward into the mid-20th century, cannabis enters a stage in its history that is both familiar and a little more complicated. The plant, which had traveled continents, accompanied cultures, and quietly eased the edges of daily life for centuries, now begins to encounter something new: formalized regulation. Governments are starting to notice it, and with notice often comes rules, restrictions, and mild social alarm, even when the substance itself is largely benign. In the United States, for example, cannabis was widely used in medical preparations in the early 1900s, often prescribed for conditions such as insomnia, pain, or mild anxiety. Pharmacies stocked tinctures and extracts. Patients would follow instructions carefully, sometimes observing subtle effects, other times noticing nothing at all, and in both cases moving on with their lives. Everything was calm, structured, and measured, much as it had been in previous centuries. But social attitudes began to shift gradually, sometimes in response to cultural anxieties, sometimes in response to prejudice, and occasionally in response to sensationalized reporting. Immigrant populations, especially Mexican laborers in the southwestern United States, were sometimes observed using cannabis recreationally. Newspapers picked up on these stories, often exaggerating or mischaracterizing minor behaviors. Writers and editors, always in search of a story, added cautionary flourishes, painting cannabis as more alarming than it truly was. This pattern, of course, is something we've seen across history. Humans are consistent in their desire to observe, comment, and regulate behaviors they don't fully understand, especially when they appear to challenge social norms. Cannabis had been quietly present for centuries, but suddenly it was entering a space where opinions, laws, and moral judgments began to intersect. Despite these emerging regulations, usage continued in private circles, often quietly. Socially, intellectuals, artists, and a few curious medical professionals maintained an interest in its effects. In parts of Europe and in urban intellectual circles in the United States, small groups explored cannabis in measured, thoughtful ways, discussing its effects on perception, mood, or creative processes. These gatherings were calm, reflective, and far removed from the sensationalist accounts that appeared in the press. Meanwhile, traditional uses persisted elsewhere in the world. In India, bhang remained an integral part of religious and cultural rituals. Festivals incorporated its consumption in controlled, communal ways, maintaining continuity with centuries-old traditions. In the Caribbean and Africa, cannabis retained both its medicinal and social roles, quietly woven into the fabric of daily life. The plant adapted once again, moving around regulation and societal suspicion with a resilience that is remarkable in hindsight. In medical contexts, cannabis continued to be observed and documented. Doctors noted its effects on pain, muscle spasms, and sleep. Pharmacies stocked tinctures and extracts, sometimes alongside more modern medications. The plant maintained its dual identity, straddling the line between traditional medicine and recreational curiosity. Even as regulation increased, these quiet uses persisted. Humans, as always, are adept at finding ways to continue habits that serve them, especially when those habits are subtle, calming, and culturally integrated. It is also worth noting that cannabis's introduction into international discussions around regulation was uneven. Some countries codified restrictions early, focusing on immigration, trade, or social norms. Others maintained a degree of tolerance, especially in areas where traditional use was deeply embedded in society. The plant's role in human life in these regions continued largely unchanged, demonstrating its quiet resilience. In literature, the arts, and intellectual circles, curiosity persisted. Writers, poets, and artists experimented with cannabis in measured doses, documenting their experiences in reflective, analytical ways. This period produced observations and anecdotes that would later inform both cultural and scientific understanding. The experimentation was largely private, understated, and deliberate. Participants approached it as a tool for insight, reflection, and subtle enhancement rather than as a catalyst for drama or chaos. By the mid-20th century, the plant was both subject to scrutiny and quietly persistent. International treaties began to include cannabis in lists of controlled substances, reflecting the anxieties of governments rather than the practical realities of everyday use. Despite these laws, cannabis continued to exist in private life, in traditional rituals, and in the measured curiosity of intellectual and artistic communities. Its presence was understated, adaptive, and surprisingly durable. The irony of this stage in cannabis history is subtle but clear. The plant had been used for thousands of years across continents and cultures, adapting to human needs and curiosities with remarkable consistency. And yet, as formal laws and regulations emerged, human perception often shifted faster than practical experience. The very substance that had quietly persisted for centuries now attracted disproportionate attention, scrutiny, and sometimes moral panic. It is easy to imagine how those living in earlier centuries might have reacted to this development. Ancient shamans, Indian festival participants, and European doctors had incorporated cannabis into daily life calmly, carefully, and without fanfare. They observed its effects, integrated it into social and spiritual contexts, and moved on with the rhythms of life. Contrast that with the emerging moral scrutiny and regulation of the 20th century, and one sees the dissonance clearly. A plant that had quietly existed for millennia suddenly caught up in human anxieties about novelty, immigration, and social order. Even so, cannabis's resilience remained. It was quietly present in private homes, intellectual circles, cultural rituals, and medical practices. Its story demonstrates a fascinating pattern. Human curiosity persists alongside regulation. Usage continues, adapts, and persists even as laws and social norms fluctuate. This quiet continuity is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the plant's history, showing how deeply embedded habits and human curiosity can transcend boundaries, regulations, and shifting cultural perceptions. And so, as we continue drifting through this timeline, we can see how cannabis's journey reflects not just a story about a plant, but a story about human adaptability, curiosity, and the quiet persistence of habit. It moves with people, adapts to social and regulatory pressures, and remains a subtle thread in the fabric of daily life. History, in this sense, is both steady and ironic. The plant endures, humans debate, and centuries unfold with gentle continuity. As we continue floating through time, the story of cannabis moves gently into the mid-20th century, a period where the plant begins to encounter more formal attention, but still quietly maintains its presence in daily life. By now, cannabis is no longer solely a medicinal or ritual plant. It is becoming a cultural thread, appearing in private homes, intellectual circles, and social settings, while governments and societies slowly start noticing, debating, and regulating it. In the United States, the early 20th century saw cannabis used in pharmacies, prescribed by physicians, and occasionally discussed in medical journals. But as immigration patterns changed and urban populations grew, cannabis also became associated with Mexican laborers and jazz musicians, among others. Newspapers and politicians began producing sensationalist accounts, often exaggerating minor behaviors and framing them as social threats. Of course, the plant itself had not changed, but human perception was evolving, and perceptions often matter more than reality when it comes to regulation. During this time, the plant retained its quiet usefulness. In private homes, people continued using cannabis medicinally or recreationally in measured ways. Patients who had relied on cannabis tinctures for insomnia or pain continued their routines without fanfare. Intellectuals and artists experimented in controlled settings, exploring creative and reflective effects, documenting experiences in journals and essays. In these contexts, cannabis was largely a tool for calm, subtle enhancement, rather than a cause for concern. Meanwhile, traditional uses persisted across the globe. In India, bhang remained central to cultural and religious practice, integrated into festivals and communal events. In the Caribbean and parts of Africa, cannabis continued to serve both medicinal and social purposes. These practices had centuries of continuity, quietly enduring through regulatory changes, colonial pressures, and the passage of time. In these regions, cannabis was simply part of life, present but unremarkable. The mid-20th century also brought scientific interest. Researchers began studying the plant in more controlled environments, documenting pharmacological effects and potential medical applications. These studies were often cautious and meticulous, reflecting both curiosity and a degree of skepticism common in scientific inquiry. Doctors observed its effects on pain, nausea, and muscle spasticity, often noting subtle outcomes rather than dramatic transformations. Cannabis, in these studies, was a subject of patient observation rather than sensationalized narratives. Simultaneously, small intellectual and artistic circles explored cannabis with measured curiosity. In urban centers, writers, poets, and musicians experimented privately, observing how it affected perception, creativity, and mood. These groups were quiet, reflective, and deliberate, creating a cultural presence that was subtle yet persistent. The contrast between public perception, sometimes anxious, sometimes sensationalist, and private usage, measured, calm, and contemplative, became more pronounced during this period. Regulation in the United States began to tighten gradually. Early laws, such as the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, introduced controls, taxes, and bureaucratic oversight. Public discourse increasingly framed cannabis as a social problem, though the plant's actual effects in daily life remained largely unchanged. People who used cannabis medicinally continued to do so quietly, Cultural experimentation continued in private circles, and traditional practices abroad persisted largely unaffected. The contrast is subtle but instructive. Cannabis itself is relatively stable, persistent, and adaptable. Human perception, regulation, and narrative fluctuate, often creating tension between lived experience and social policy. The plant moves quietly through these shifting landscapes, maintaining continuity even as society's attention intensifies. By the 1940s and 1950s, cannabis was firmly established as a quietly present but increasingly scrutinized substance. Medical and traditional uses persisted, private experimentation continued, and small cultural communities maintained curiosity and reflection. Meanwhile, social anxieties and policy frameworks grew louder, setting the stage for the more dramatic cultural shifts that would emerge in the later decades of the century. Through all of this, one theme remains constant. Humans are remarkably consistent in their curiosity, experimentation, and adaptation. Across continents and centuries, people have integrated cannabis into daily life, rituals, medicine, and reflection. Regulatory frameworks, social judgments, and moral panics come and go, but the quiet persistence of human habit and curiosity endures. And so, as we continue this slow journey through history, we observe cannabis quietly bridging cultures, centuries, and contexts. It adapts without fuss, providing subtle comfort, reflection, and utility to those who encounter it. Even as regulation and public attention increase, its presence remains steady, resilient, and often understated, a constant companion to human curiosity and the search for calm. As we continue drifting through time, the story of cannabis moves gently into the late 20th century, a period of slow but noticeable change. By now, the plant has persisted quietly for millennia, moving through cultures, continents, and centuries with remarkable consistency. But in this era, human curiosity, social change, and cultural experimentation begin to amplify its presence, creating new contexts for its use, while regulation and public attention continue to shape perceptions. In the 1960s and 1970s, cannabis quietly became associated with broader cultural movements. The rise of countercultural communities, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, introduced new ways of thinking about personal freedom, social norms, and experimentation. Cannabis was present in small doses in homes, cafes, and communal spaces. It was rarely used for dramatic purposes. Instead, it provided a gentle accompaniment to reflection, conversation, music, and art. People were curious, thoughtful, and in many cases, quite deliberate in their approach. During this period, popular media began to notice cannabis more often, though reporting was uneven. Some accounts exaggerated its effects, associating it with social disorder or rebellious behavior. Others approached it with mild curiosity, noting its subtle influence on perception and mood. The contrast between sensationalized narratives and the everyday reality of measured use became even more pronounced. Cannabis itself remained unchanged. It was human interpretation that fluctuated dramatically. At the same time, traditional uses continued across the globe. In India, bhang maintained its ritual and festive significance, particularly during Holi and other cultural celebrations. In the Caribbean, cannabis remained integrated into spiritual practices, medicinal routines, and social gatherings. In these contexts, the plant's role was stable, familiar, and largely unremarkable, used quietly with continuity that stretched back centuries. Medical research also continued during the late 20th century. Researchers in laboratories, hospitals, and universities began studying cannabis with increasing sophistication, observing its effects on pain, nausea, muscle spasticity, and sleep. While regulations limited certain types of study, the scientific community maintained curiosity. Observations were often detailed, cautious, and methodical, reflecting both the complexity of the plant and the subtlety of its effects. By the late 1970s, social and political pressures began influencing cannabis regulation more heavily. International treaties, domestic legislation, and public campaigns increasingly framed the plant as a substance requiring oversight. Despite this, private use remained widespread. People continued to incorporate cannabis into daily routines, reflection, creative work, and communal experiences. Its presence persisted quietly, even as attention intensified. This period also highlights the subtle irony of human behavior. Across history, cannabis had been quietly used for centuries, embedded in medicine, ritual, and cultural practice. Yet in the 20th century, regulatory and moral frameworks suddenly elevated its visibility, creating tension between perception and lived reality. The plant itself remained stable, reliable, and adaptable, but human narratives around it became increasingly complex. In artistic and intellectual communities, cannabis continued to be explored as a tool for thought and reflection. Writers, musicians, and visual artists incorporated it into their creative processes with measured care. Its effects were subtle, often enhancing reflection, perception, and dialogue, rather than inducing dramatic or chaotic states. These communities maintained continuity with centuries of measured, reflective use, even as public discourse intensified. By the 1980s, cannabis had become a fixture in popular culture, albeit with heightened scrutiny. Public policy, law enforcement, and media coverage increasingly focused on its presence, while private use persisted quietly. Cultural representations ranged from casual depictions in music and film to sensationalized accounts in news outlets. Through it all, the plant remained a constant companion, its historical role in human life unchanged, a subtle, adaptive tool for reflection, comfort, and curiosity. In medical contexts, the late 20th century also saw renewed interest. Physicians and researchers explored its applications for conditions ranging from chronic pain to chemotherapy-induced nausea. These studies were often cautious and measured, reflecting both curiosity and responsibility. Cannabis maintained its dual identity, straddling the line between traditional medicine and recreational exploration. It adapted to the needs of users without demanding attention, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of social and legal scrutiny. Globally, traditional practices continued largely uninterrupted. Bong in India, spiritual use in the Caribbean, and medicinal applications in Africa persisted quietly, embedded in cultural routines and rituals. The plant remained a familiar, reliable presence, demonstrating continuity that contrasts sharply with the more chaotic social and political narratives emerging in the West. Through all of this, one theme becomes clear. Cannabis's history is defined not by drama or sudden shifts, but by persistence, adaptability, and subtle integration into human life. Across continents, centuries, and cultural contexts, people have used it to soften the edges of daily existence, to reflect, to explore creativity, and to maintain continuity with ritual and tradition. And so, as we drift toward the end of the 20th century, we can observe a plant that is simultaneously stable and adaptable, quietly enduring in the face of social, legal, and cultural change. Its presence is understated, measured, and consistent, a reflection of the slow, deliberate rhythms of human curiosity and habit. As we continue floating through time, the story of cannabis moves gently into the late 20th century, a period of slow but noticeable change. By now, the plant has persisted quietly for millennia, moving through cultures, continents, and centuries with remarkable consistency. In this era, human curiosity, social change, and cultural experimentation begin to amplify its presence, creating new contexts for its use, while regulation and public attention continue to shape perceptions. In the 1960s and 1970s, cannabis quietly became associated with broader cultural movements. The rise of countercultural communities, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, introduced new ways of thinking about personal freedom, social norms, and experimentation. Cannabis was present in small doses in homes, cafes, and communal spaces. It was rarely used for dramatic purposes. Instead, it provided a gentle accompaniment to reflection, conversation, music, and art. People were curious, thoughtful, and in many cases quite deliberate in their approach. During this period, popular media began to notice cannabis more often, though reporting was uneven. Some accounts exaggerated its effects, associating it with social disorder or rebellious behavior. Others approached it with mild curiosity, noting its subtle influence on perception and mood. The contrast between sensationalized narratives and the everyday reality of measured use became even more pronounced. Cannabis itself remained unchanged. It was human interpretation that fluctuated dramatically. At the same time, traditional uses continued across the globe. In India, bhang maintained its ritual and festive significance, particularly during Holi and other cultural celebrations. In the Caribbean, cannabis remained integrated into spiritual practices, medicinal routines, and social gatherings. These practices had centuries of continuity, quietly enduring through regulatory changes, colonial pressures, and the passage of time. In these regions, cannabis was simply part of life, present but unremarkable. Medical research also continued during the late 20th century. Researchers in laboratories, hospitals, and universities began studying cannabis with increasing sophistication, observing its effects on pain, nausea, muscle spasticity, and sleep. While regulations limited certain types of study, the scientific community maintained curiosity. Observations were often detailed, cautious, and methodical, reflecting both the complexity of the plant and the subtlety of its effects. By the late 1970s, social and political pressures began influencing cannabis regulation more heavily. International treaties, domestic legislation, and public campaigns increasingly framed the plant as a substance requiring oversight. Despite this, private use remained widespread. People continued to incorporate cannabis into daily routines, reflection, creative work, and communal experiences. Its presence persisted quietly, even as attention intensified. This period also highlights the subtle irony of human behavior. Across history, cannabis had been quietly used for centuries, embedded in medicine, ritual, and cultural practice. Yet in the 20th century, regulatory and moral frameworks suddenly elevated its visibility, creating tension between perception and lived reality. The plant itself remained stable, reliable, and adaptable, but human narratives around it became increasingly complex. In artistic and intellectual communities, cannabis continued to be explored as a tool for thought and reflection. Writers, musicians, and visual artists incorporated it into their creative processes with measured care. Its effects were subtle, often enhancing reflection, perception, and dialogue rather than inducing dramatic or chaotic states. These communities maintained continuity with centuries of measured, reflective use, even as public discourse intensified. By the 1980s, cannabis had become a fixture in popular culture, albeit with heightened scrutiny. Public policy, law enforcement, and media coverage increasingly focused on its presence, while private use persisted quietly. Cultural representations ranged from casual depictions in music and film to sensationalized accounts in news outlets. Through it all, the plant remained a constant companion, its historical role in human life unchanged, a subtle, adaptive tool for reflection, comfort, and curiosity. In medical contexts, the late 20th century also saw renewed interest. Physicians and researchers explored its applications for conditions ranging from chronic pain to chemotherapy-induced nausea. These studies were often cautious and measured, reflecting both curiosity and responsibility. Cannabis maintained its dual identity, straddling the line between traditional medicine and recreational exploration. It adapted to the needs of users without demanding attention, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of social and legal scrutiny. Globally, traditional practices continued largely interrupted. Bhang in India, spiritual use in the Caribbean, and medicinal applications in Africa persisted quietly, embedded in cultural routines and rituals. The plant remained a familiar, reliable presence, demonstrating continuity that contrasts sharply with the more chaotic social and political narratives emerging in the West. Through all of this, one theme becomes clear. Cannabis's history is defined not by drama or sudden shifts, but by persistence, adaptability, and subtle integration into human life. Across continents, centuries, and cultural contexts, People have used it to soften the edges of daily existence, to reflect, to explore creativity, and to maintain continuity with ritual and tradition. Cannabis demonstrates a remarkable capacity for quiet endurance. It bridges cultures and centuries, adapting to new social norms, regulatory landscapes, and cultural attitudes. It exists simultaneously as medicine, ritual, and subtle recreation. Its story is less about dramatic upheavals and more about the steady, persistent rhythms of human curiosity, habit, and reflection. Even in periods of heightened regulation and public scrutiny, its presence remains understated yet consistent. People continue to explore, reflect, and adapt, and in doing so, they sustain a centuries-long relationship with this plant that is calm, thoughtful, and deeply human. History, in this sense, reveals not a series of sudden transformations, but a slow, measured continuity. Cannabis, quietly present for millennia, continues to adapt, persist, and quietly influence human life, offering gentle relief, reflection, and a reminder of the subtle ways people seek comfort, creativity, and connection across time and place.
As we drift into the closing decades of the 20th century, cannabis finds itself occupying multiple spaces at once. It is quietly persistent in private lives, culturally entrenched in traditional practices, cautiously explored in medical and scientific circles, and increasingly visible in public discourse. The plant, which had traveled continents, centuries, and social systems, now faces an era in which perception and regulation are intensifying, even while its actual use remains measured, reflective, and often quietly domestic. In North America, the 1980s and 1990s were periods of paradoxical coexistence. Cannabis was becoming a fixture of youth and countercultural movements, present in music, art, and film, while simultaneously being scrutinized under increasingly strict legal frameworks. Governments implemented stricter enforcement policies, public service campaigns warned against its use, and legal penalties were heightened. Despite this, private use, carefully measured, continued across households, social circles, and communities. Its role as a source of reflection, mild relaxation, or occasional creative enhancement persisted, largely untouched by the public debate. In intellectual circles, cannabis retained its historical continuity as a tool for reflection and creative exploration. Writers, artists, and musicians engaged with it quietly, often using it to enhance mood, perception, or focus, rather than to produce chaos or dramatic outcomes. The effects were subtle, personal, and context-dependent. People learned to incorporate it in ways that were deliberate and structured, mirroring centuries of prior practice in other cultures. Globally, traditional practices remained largely unaffected by new regulatory climates. In India, bhang continued to be integrated into holy celebrations, local rituals, and communal consumption, often in measured amounts that reinforced social cohesion and cultural identity. In the Caribbean, cannabis retained its spiritual and medicinal roles, quietly woven into daily life and ritual. Across Africa, traditional medicinal applications persisted, while in Asia, cannabis continued to serve as a culturally significant botanical with medicinal and ritual uses. Across these regions, centuries of cultural integration shielded the plant from sudden upheaval, allowing it to endure quietly even in the face of global attention and regulation. In medical research, cannabis entered a period of renewed curiosity and cautious study. Physicians and scientists began to investigate its efficacy for chronic pain, nausea associated with chemotherapy, neurological conditions, and muscle spasticity. These studies were careful, deliberate, and methodical, reflecting both the complexity of the plant and the constraints of legal oversight. Researchers noted subtle effects, sometimes promising, sometimes ambiguous, but always measured and carefully documented. Cannabis retained its dual identity, straddling medicine, ritual, and mild social exploration. Meanwhile, public discourse often focused on fear, misunderstanding, or sensationalism. Media accounts frequently exaggerated anecdotal observations, framing cannabis as a social threat.
In many cases, reporting misrepresented historical use, medical applications, and cultural practices, creating a distorted narrative. The plant itself remained unchanged, quietly persistent in households, cultural traditions, and controlled experimentation. It was human interpretation that fluctuated dramatically, often divorced from empirical reality. The late 20th century also saw the emergence of advocacy, legal challenges, and community-based reform movements. Grassroots organizations and medical advocates began arguing for the recognition of cannabis's therapeutic potential and the reconsideration of harsh legal penalties. These efforts were deliberate, patient, and often slow-moving, relying on scientific evidence, personal testimony, and cultural continuity to argue for reform. Cannabis, in these contexts, was both a literal plant and a symbol of continuity, resilience, and measured human curiosity. In popular culture, cannabis began to occupy a more nuanced space. Music, particularly genres such as jazz, reggae, hip-hop, and rock, referenced cannabis both literally and metaphorically, while visual arts occasionally explored its role in perception and creativity. Film and television depictions ranged from casual background usage to more dramatized narratives, often highlighting tension between individual choice and social regulation. Despite this attention, personal use for reflection, creativity, and mild relaxation continued quietly, largely consistent with historical patterns. The late 20th century also highlighted an ongoing global divergence in perception and regulation. In some nations, strict prohibition and enforcement policies created heightened risk, while in others, cultural and traditional integration provided stability. This divergence illustrates the plant's remarkable adaptability. It persists across social, political, and cultural contexts, surviving scrutiny, misunderstanding, and legal frameworks, while maintaining a quiet continuity of use. Medical research continued to advance incrementally. Studies explored cannabis's effect on neurological conditions such as multiple sclerosis, chronic pain syndromes, and appetite stimulation in cases of severe illness. These observations were subtle, often relying on patient-reported outcomes and careful clinical measurement. These studies emphasized the nuanced and individualized nature of cannabis's effects, highlighting how long-standing human experience aligned with empirical observation. The plant is versatile, subtle, and rarely dramatic, but potentially useful in measured contexts. Across decades, cannabis maintained a unique dual identity. It was at once a culturally embedded substance, a medicinal tool, and a focus of legal and social debate. This continuity across domains is remarkable. While public perception and legal structures evolved rapidly, individual and cultural use remained steady, reflecting centuries of historical precedent. Social experimentation continued quietly. In urban environments, people incorporated cannabis into reflective practices, conversation, creative work, and social gatherings. Its effects were subtle, enhancing perception, introspection, or calm, rather than producing dramatic or chaotic outcomes. These practices mirrored centuries of careful integration observed in traditional societies, reflecting an enduring human tendency to approach the plant thoughtfully, deliberately, and with reflection. The mid to late 20th century also marked the rise of subtle scientific nuance. Researchers began to differentiate between cannabinoid compounds, understanding the physiological pathways and potential therapeutic applications. Studies began isolating active compounds such as THC and CBD, examining their distinct effects. This period of study emphasized precision, patience, and careful observation, reflecting centuries of practical human experience filtered through modern scientific methodology. Cannabis's story in this period is one of quiet tension between continuity and attention. The plant persists in domestic, social, and traditional contexts, demonstrating resilience and adaptability. Simultaneously, public perception, regulation, and media narratives increasingly frame it as controversial, misunderstood, or threatening. This duality is striking. Human curiosity, reflection, and practical use persist even amid growing external scrutiny. In many ways, the late 20th century sets the stage for modern developments. Cannabis has been integrated into domestic life, cultural expression, intellectual exploration, and medical inquiry for centuries. Its journey demonstrates remarkable persistence, subtle adaptability, and quiet continuity across time and space. Even as public discourse, legal frameworks, and media attention intensify, the plant remains fundamentally consistent in its effects, applications, and role in human life. Across continents, traditional use continues uninterrupted. In India, festivals continue to integrate bong. In the Caribbean, spiritual practice and social use persist. In Africa, medicinal applications endure. Even in regions with strict regulation, individuals maintain private use for reflection, creativity, or mild relaxation. This continuity reinforces a historical pattern. Cannabis thrives quietly in human life, maintaining subtle utility and cultural significance even in the face of external scrutiny. Through these decades, cannabis illustrates a broader lesson about human behavior. Curiosity, adaptation, and measured experimentation persist despite regulatory pressures, social judgment, or cultural misunderstanding. Human engagement with cannabis is deliberate, reflective, and historically continuous, showing remarkable stability across centuries. This period also highlights the subtle irony of cannabis's history. For thousands of years, the plant quietly accompanied human societies, providing relief, reflection, and ritual integration. In the 20th century, public attention, legal scrutiny, and social debate amplify its presence dramatically, even though the plant itself remains unchanged. Continuity of use persists quietly amid a growing chorus of commentary, illustrating both the resilience of human habit and the tendency of societies to sensationalize familiar practices. By the turn of the 21st century, cannabis exists in multiple overlapping domains: traditional practice, private reflection.
As we drift further into the early decades of the 21st century, the story of cannabis becomes increasingly intertwined with legal reform, public policy, and shifting cultural attitudes. The plant, which has quietly persisted across continents, centuries, and social systems, now encounters an era of unprecedented visibility. Yet despite new attention, its historical patterns of measured use, cultural integration, and subtle personal impact remain remarkably consistent. In North America, the 2010s marked a dramatic shift in legal landscapes. Several U.S. states legalized cannabis for recreational use, following earlier medical programs. These reforms were deliberate, structured, and heavily regulated. Legalization frameworks emphasized controlled production, distribution, taxation, and quality assurance. Licensed dispensaries became points of both commerce and social normalization, offering cannabis products in measured doses, labeled for potency and content. Despite this public visibility, daily personal use often retained the quiet, reflective, and measured qualities that had persisted for centuries. The legal shift brought with it a new level of public discourse. Cannabis became a topic of policy debate, economic analysis, and cultural discussion. Media coverage ranged from cautious reporting on regulatory developments to celebratory accounts of economic potential. Yet amidst this growing attention, private use remained remarkably consistent. Individuals continued to incorporate cannabis into personal routines, social gatherings, and creative work in ways that were subtle, deliberate, and historically continuous. Medical research expanded in this decade, exploring applications across a broad spectrum of conditions. Studies investigated chronic pain, neurological disorders, chemotherapy-induced nausea, anxiety, and sleep disturbances. Researchers examined cannabinoid profiles, terpene interactions, and dose-dependent effects, often emphasizing careful observation and methodological precision. Outcomes were nuanced and context-dependent, reflecting what centuries of human experience had already suggested. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but can provide subtle, meaningful relief and reflection when used thoughtfully. Globally, traditional uses continued largely uninterrupted.
Bong festivals in India, spiritual practices in the Caribbean, and medicinal applications in Africa persisted quietly, insulated from the dramatic shifts in Western legal frameworks. These practices underscore the plant's enduring adaptability. While policy, culture, and media attention fluctuated, cannabis remained a steady, quietly integrated element of daily and ritual life across diverse contexts. The 2010s also brought attention to cannabis's economic and commercial potential. Legal markets encouraged professional cultivation, quality assurance, and product differentiation. Edibles, tinctures, and specialized strains became more common, reflecting both consumer preference and regulatory compliance. This commercialization introduced new social dimensions, including debates over accessibility, equity, and public health, while personal and traditional use continued quietly in parallel. Cultural engagement intensified alongside these changes. Music, literature, film, and visual arts increasingly referenced cannabis, often exploring personal experiences, creative processes, or reflective states. In urban and intellectual communities, measured experimentation persisted. Individuals used cannabis to enhance creativity, facilitate conversation, and encourage contemplation rather than provoke chaos or sensational outcomes. This continuity reflects centuries-old practices observed across continents, maintaining historical patterns of subtle, reflective engagement. Public perception continued to evolve. While some embraced legalization as a sign of social progress and personal freedom, others remained cautious, emphasizing potential health risks, impaired judgment, or moral concerns. Despite these divergent attitudes, personal use remained largely unchanged in its character. People continued to integrate cannabis thoughtfully into routines, social interactions, and creative practices, demonstrating a remarkable continuity with past patterns of human engagement. Medical research and clinical practice further refined understanding of cannabis's effects. Investigations into cannabinoids such as THC and CBD emphasized their distinct physiological and psychological impacts. Studies explored dosage, delivery methods, and therapeutic contexts, reinforcing the plant's versatility and subtlety. Clinical observations often highlighted incremental benefits, reduced pain, improved sleep, enhanced appetite, rather than dramatic transformations, consistent with centuries of measured human experience. Internationally, regulatory approaches diverged. Some nations maintained strict prohibition, while others moved towards decriminalization or full legalization. The global mosaic illustrates cannabis's adaptability. It thrives in culturally embedded traditional contexts, persists in private use under restrictive frameworks, and integrates into regulated markets where permitted. Across all these domains, the plant's role remains quietly consistent, serving reflection, creativity, ritual, and subtle personal benefit. Social practices during this period illustrate the plant's enduring subtlety. Individuals and small groups maintained centuries-old traditions of measured experimentation. Cannabis accompanied conversation, meditation, creative work, and mild relaxation. Its effects were often gentle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful, reinforcing patterns of human engagement observed for generations. Even as commercialization and legalization increased visibility, private experience retained its historical characteristics: calm, deliberate, and reflective.
The 2010s also highlighted generational shifts in perception. Younger cohorts, growing up amid increasing legalization and normalized discussion, approached cannabis with curiosity, experimentation, and cautious reflection. Education, social context, and legal clarity allowed measured use while reducing the dramatic moral panic that had characterized previous decades. Despite these shifts, the underlying patterns of subtle engagement, reflection, and careful use persisted. Cultural continuity remained strong. Traditional practices, intellectual exploration, and artistic experimentation continued to coexist with commercial and legal frameworks. Cannabis maintained a dual identity, both a culturally embedded and historically persistent tool for reflection and a regulated commodity subject to modern oversight. This duality highlights its remarkable adaptability and ongoing relevance across multiple social, cultural, and economic contexts. Medical discourse advanced alongside these cultural and legal changes. Studies examined long-term outcomes, therapeutic applications, and safety profiles. Researchers emphasized incremental improvements,
subtle therapeutic benefits, and individualized dosing. This careful approach reflected centuries of experience. Cannabis rarely produces dramatic or uniform effects, but it can provide subtle, context-dependent benefits that enhance daily life, creativity, and reflection. Despite commercialization and regulatory attention, private use maintained centuries-old continuity. Individuals continued to engage in reflective, measured consumption for creativity, social interaction, relaxation, and mild therapeutic purposes. These practices demonstrate the quiet resilience of human engagement with cannabis, stable, subtle, and historically continuous across legal, cultural, and social transformations. Internationally, traditional use remained largely unaffected by new legal and commercial frameworks. Indian festivals continued integrating bhang, Caribbean spiritual practices persisted, and African medicinal applications endured. These centuries-old traditions highlight cannabis's enduring adaptability. It thrives quietly, persisting across diverse cultural and regulatory contexts without losing its essential character. The economic dimensions of legalization introduced new social and cultural patterns. Cannabis cultivation, distribution, and retail expanded carefully, emphasizing quality, standardization, and consumer education. These developments reflected a modern adaptation of centuries-old principles: careful attention to quality, measured dosing, and deliberate integration into daily life. Personal and traditional use continued quietly in parallel, reinforcing continuity across historical and cultural contexts. Cultural production, including music, literature, film, and visual art, increasingly referenced cannabis as a source of inspiration, reflection, and creative exploration. Individuals used the plant to enhance perception, facilitate dialogue, and support introspective or collaborative practices. Its effects remained subtle, context-dependent, and historically consistent, an accompaniment to thought, social engagement, and mild enhancement rather than a source of chaos or dramatic transformation. Socially, cannabis continued to operate within a framework of quiet reflection. Individuals incorporated it into private routines, creative projects, social gatherings, and contemplative practices. Its effects were nuanced and context-sensitive, reinforcing historical patterns of subtle, measured engagement. Even as public discourse, legal frameworks, and commercial markets intensified, personal and cultural use persisted quietly, illustrating remarkable continuity across time. Public perception of cannabis in the 2010s was complex. While some embraced legalization as a step toward personal freedom, social equity, and creative exploration, others emphasized potential health risks, moral concerns, and regulatory challenges. Despite these divergent perspectives, private use remained largely consistent, measured, reflective, and historically grounded. Cannabis continued to provide subtle relief, creative enhancement, and contemplative accompaniment, quietly bridging centuries of human engagement. Medical research increasingly focused on nuanced applications. Studies examined THC and CBD individually and in combination, considering dosage, delivery methods, and patient-specific outcomes. Observations emphasized incremental improvements, subtle therapeutic benefits, and context-dependent effects. These findings reflected the plant's historical role: a subtle, adaptive companion to human reflection, creativity, and daily life, rather than a source of dramatic change or spectacle. Cultural continuity persisted across decades. Traditional practices, private experimentation, medical research, and creative engagement coexisted with modern legal and commercial frameworks. Cannabis maintained a dual identity: a historically embedded tool for reflection, creativity, and ritual, and a regulated commodity adapted to contemporary markets. This duality highlights its remarkable adaptability, subtle persistence, and enduring relevance across diverse social and cultural contexts. Private use of cannabis remained quietly consistent. Individuals and small communities maintained practices of measured experimentation, creative engagement, and reflective use. Its effects were subtle, context-dependent, and historically continuous. Even amid commercialization, legal reform, and public attention, personal engagement retained the centuries-old patterns of calm, deliberate, and reflective use. In the 2010s, cannabis illustrates a remarkable historical continuity. Across medical, cultural, social, and traditional contexts, it persists quietly, subtly, and adaptively. Its effects remain nuanced, context-sensitive, and personally meaningful. Despite intensified social visibility, regulatory frameworks, and commercial interest, its role in daily life retains historical consistency, a calm, reflective companion across time, culture, and circumstance. Human engagement with cannabis in this period reflects centuries of continuity. Curiosity, measured experimentation, and reflective use persist despite social, legal, and commercial transformations. The plant continues to provide subtle relief, creative enhancement, contemplative opportunity, and cultural integration. Its historical trajectory demonstrates resilience, adaptability, and enduring presence across diverse contexts. The story of cannabis in the 2010s is defined not by dramatic upheaval, but by subtle shifts, persistent continuity, and gradual social adaptation. It remains quietly integrated into daily life, creative practice, and cultural expression, maintaining patterns of measured, reflective use observed for centuries. Cannabis bridges traditional, modern, and private spheres, demonstrating remarkable resilience and subtle persistence across the early 21st century. Even as legalization, commercialization, and public attention grow, private and cultural use retain historical continuity. Individuals continue to use cannabis for reflection, creativity, mild relaxation, and therapeutic support. Its effects remain subtle, measured, and context-dependent. The plant's presence across centuries, continents, and cultures illustrates enduring human engagement characterized by patience, curiosity, and thoughtful integration. Cannabis continues to exemplify the slow, persistent rhythms of human history. It bridges past and present, traditional and modern, domestic and public. Its subtle effects, historical continuity, and cultural adaptability demonstrate the remarkable capacity of both the plant and human users to persist, reflect, and integrate across centuries. Quiet, resilient, and adaptive, cannabis endures in the 2010s as it has for millennia. It reflects the subtle persistence of human curiosity, the careful integration of centuries-old practices, and the enduring presence of measured, reflective engagement. Across all contexts, cultural, medical, social, and economic, it remains a gentle, adaptive companion to human life.
As we settle into the 2020s, cannabis occupies a unique and complex space, bridging historical continuity with modern transformation. The plant, which has quietly threaded through millennia of human life, now encounters unprecedented visibility, legal frameworks, and cultural normalization. Yet despite public attention, media scrutiny, and commercial expansion, personal use remains remarkably consistent with historical patterns, reflective, measured, and quietly adaptive. In North America, the 2020s have seen a growing number of jurisdictions legalize recreational cannabis. States, provinces, and territories have developed regulatory frameworks emphasizing controlled cultivation, testing for safety and potency, and the prevention of underage access. Legalization is often accompanied by taxation, licensing, and quality standards, ensuring that products meet predictable criteria. For individual users, this means predictable effects, transparent content, and structured access. Despite the visibility of commercial markets, personal consumption often remains private, reflective, and historically continuous. The growth of legal markets has introduced new social and economic dynamics. Cannabis entrepreneurship, professional cultivation, product innovation, and ancillary industries have flourished under careful regulation. Edibles, tinctures, capsules, beverages, and specialty strains offer users variety and choice, allowing tailored experiences that reflect both individual needs and historical patterns of measured use. Commercial expansion exists alongside personal continuity. People still consume in small, deliberate amounts, often for reflection, mild relaxation, or creative exploration. Medical research has expanded further in this decade, exploring both therapeutic applications and biochemical mechanisms. Studies examine chronic pain, neurological disorders,
mental health conditions, sleep disturbances, and appetite regulation. Research has become increasingly sophisticated, exploring interactions among cannabinoids, terpenes, and other plant constituents. Studies emphasize individualized effects, highlighting that cannabis rarely produces uniform outcomes. This mirrors centuries of human observation, subtle, context-dependent effects quietly integrated into daily life. Global legal landscapes remain diverse. While some countries maintain strict prohibition, others have decriminalized possession, legalized medical use, or implemented full recreational frameworks. In Europe, Canada, parts of Latin America, and certain African nations, cannabis has moved toward legal integration. In other regions, traditional practices, clandestine cultivation, or measured private use persist. This diversity illustrates the plant's remarkable adaptability. It continues quietly across multiple legal, cultural, and social contexts without losing its essential characteristics. Traditional practices remained largely unaffected. In India, bong festivals continue, reinforcing communal and cultural identity. In the Caribbean, spiritual and social use persists quietly, embedded in centuries of practice. Across Africa, traditional medicinal applications endure, providing therapeutic and social continuity. These long-standing cultural practices underscore cannabis's resilience and adaptability, demonstrating continuity that outlasts legal shifts, social attention, and commercial change. Cultural integration has deepened in the 2020s. Music, literature, visual arts, and film continue to reference cannabis, often exploring reflective, creative, or subtly transformative experiences. In creative communities, measured experimentation persists. Artists, writers, and musicians use cannabis to enhance perception, facilitate dialogue, or support introspection. These practices maintain historical patterns of subtle engagement, personal, reflective, and context-sensitive rather than chaotic or dramatic. Socially, cannabis remains embedded in domestic and communal life. Individuals use it for mild relaxation, conversation, contemplation, or creative activity. Its effects are often subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Even as commercial, legal, and media attention intensifies, personal and communal use demonstrates remarkable historical continuity. The quiet, reflective nature of engagement persists across centuries, continents, and cultural contexts. Medical research in this decade has grown more refined. Clinical trials explore strain-specific effects, cannabinoid ratios, terpene interactions, and long-term safety profiles. Observations often emphasize incremental improvements, subtle relief, and context-specific outcomes. These findings reinforce a long-standing historical pattern. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but can provide meaningful benefit when used thoughtfully and deliberately. Cannabis commercialization has also introduced a layer of social education. Dispensaries, product labeling, and public campaigns often emphasize dosing, potency, and responsible use. Consumers have access to detailed information on strain profiles, cannabinoid content, and potential effects. This structured approach mirrors historical practices, emphasizing careful measurement, subtlety, and reflection. Despite public visibility and commercial presence, private engagement retains centuries-old qualities of measured use, thoughtful reflection, and creative exploration. Internationally, legal and social landscapes remain diverse. Certain countries have fully integrated cannabis into recreational and medical frameworks, while others maintain prohibition. Traditional cultural practices persist across regions, illustrating cannabis's resilience and adaptability. Its quiet, continuous presence reinforces a pattern observed across millennia. Human engagement with cannabis is deliberate, context-sensitive, and historically persistent.
Cultural continuity is evident in both creative and social contexts. Cannabis accompanies music, literature, film, visual art, and performance in subtle, reflective ways. Individuals use the plant to enhance perception, support introspection, or facilitate dialogue. Effects remain context-dependent, nuanced, and historically consistent. Across centuries, cannabis serves as a gentle companion to reflection, creativity, and social cohesion, rather than as a source of chaos or sensationalism. In private life, cannabis continues to follow established patterns of measured engagement. Individuals integrate it into daily routines, social gatherings, and creative work. Its effects remain subtle, context-sensitive, and personally meaningful. Even amid growing legalization, commercial attention, and media visibility, private use maintains historical continuity, echoing centuries of reflective, deliberate engagement. Medical research increasingly emphasizes nuanced applications and individualized approaches. Studies examine THC, CBD, and minor cannabinoids in combination with terpenes and other plant constituents. Researchers focus on patient-centered outcomes, incremental improvements, and subtle therapeutic effects. These findings align with historical experience. Cannabis is versatile, subtle, and capable of providing quiet benefit without producing dramatic or uniform effects. Cultural, social, and medical engagement in the 2020s demonstrates a remarkable balance of continuity and adaptation. Cannabis has adapted to legal, commercial, and cultural changes while retaining historical patterns of subtle, reflective use. Its persistent presence across diverse contexts illustrates resilience, adaptability, and enduring relevance in human life. Social practices continue centuries-old patterns of integration. Individuals and small groups maintain traditions of measured experimentation, creative exploration, and reflective use. Effects are subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Despite commercialization, regulatory frameworks, and public attention, private engagement remains consistent with historical continuity. Public discourse highlights ongoing tensions. Legalization, commercialization, and media attention generate debate over health, morality, and social impact. Despite these discussions, the plant's role in individuals' lives remains calm, measured, and historically grounded. Cannabis continues to provide subtle relief, creative enhancement, contemplative space, and cultural continuity, bridging centuries of human engagement. Medical and scientific research reinforces the plant's historical adaptability. Studies explore cannabinoid interactions, therapeutic applications, dosage variations, and safety profiles. Findings emphasize subtle, individualized benefits rather than dramatic effects. This mirrors centuries of human experience, highlighting continuity in both use and observed outcomes. Cultural continuity remains robust. Traditional practices persist, creative engagement continues, and private reflection maintains historical patterns. Cannabis simultaneously operates as a historically embedded tool for reflection, creativity, and ritual, and a regulated commodity adapted to contemporary legal, commercial, and medical frameworks. This duality highlights adaptability, subtle persistence, and enduring relevance across centuries and societies. Even with commercialization, heightened visibility, and shifting legal frameworks, personal and cultural use remains historically consistent. Individuals continue subtle, reflective engagement for creativity, contemplation, mild relaxation, and therapeutic support. Its effects are context-sensitive, nuanced, and historically grounded. Cannabis persists quietly, bridging centuries of human experience and ongoing modern transformation. Through the 2020s, cannabis continues to demonstrate the slow, persistent rhythms of human engagement. It bridges past and present, traditional and modern, domestic and public. Its subtle effects, historical continuity, and cultural adaptation reflect enduring patterns of curiosity, measured experimentation, and reflective use across millennia. Quiet, resilient, and adaptive, cannabis endures in the 2020s much as it has for centuries. It embodies centuries of human curiosity, careful integration, and reflective engagement. Across medical, cultural, social, and economic contexts, it remains a gentle, adaptive companion to human life, quietly threading through history while adapting to modern realities. As we move further into the 2020s, cannabis finds itself at the intersection of global cultural shifts, evolving legal frameworks, and ongoing scientific exploration. The plant, which has quietly persisted through centuries and across continents, now faces unprecedented attention from governments, researchers, businesses, and everyday people. Yet despite this increased visibility, its historical patterns of personal use, subtle, reflective, and measured, remain largely unchanged.
cannabis continues to occupy the calm, quietly influential space it has held for millennia. Globally, legalization and decriminalization continue to unfold unevenly. In parts of Europe, North America, and Latin America, recreational markets expand steadily, regulated by licensing systems, quality standards, and taxation. These markets emphasize safety, consistency, and responsible use. Products are labeled with THC and CBD content, dosing recommendations, and clear consumption guidance. This structured approach mirrors historical patterns of careful measurement and deliberate use, echoing the same principles that guided private experimentation centuries ago. Meanwhile, in other regions, strict prohibition persists. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa maintain legal restrictions on possession and use, often accompanied by social or cultural stigma. Despite these restrictions, private use endures. Individuals continue centuries-old practices of quiet, reflective engagement, sometimes in domestic settings or discrete communal contexts. Cannabis demonstrates remarkable adaptability, maintaining continuity even in environments of restriction, cultural opposition, or legal uncertainty. Traditional cultural practices remain resilient. In India, bong continues to play a central role in holy celebrations and ritual contexts. Caribbean spiritual use persists in religious and community ceremonies. African communities maintain medicinal applications, utilizing cannabis as a therapeutic tool within long-standing health traditions. Across these regions, the plant's role has remained largely uninterrupted, reflecting centuries of integration into social, cultural, and spiritual life. These enduring practices highlight cannabis's historical resilience and its ability to adapt quietly across generations and geographies. Scientific research continues to expand the understanding of cannabis. By the mid-2020s, studies are increasingly sophisticated, examining minor cannabinoids, terpene interactions, and dosage-dependent effects. Investigators investigate therapeutic applications in chronic pain, neurological disorders, sleep disturbances, anxiety, and appetite modulation. Clinical trials emphasize patient-centered outcomes and subtle, incremental improvements rather than dramatic transformations. The results reinforce what human experience has consistently demonstrated for millennia. Cannabis rarely produces uniform or explosive effects, but when used thoughtfully, it provides meaningful, context-dependent benefits. In creative and intellectual communities, cannabis maintains its traditional role as a quiet facilitator of reflection, contemplation, and subtle inspiration. Writers, musicians, visual artists, and thinkers continue to integrate the plant into personal and collaborative processes. Its effects are often gentle and nuanced, enhancing perception, encouraging focus, and fostering conversation. Across centuries, these patterns of subtle engagement have remained consistent, demonstrating continuity in human interaction with the plant, despite changes in legality, visibility, or cultural context. Social practices surrounding cannabis continue to reflect centuries of measured use. Individuals and small groups incorporate it into daily life, creative projects, meditation, and mild relaxation. Its effects remain context-dependent, subtle, and personally meaningful. Even amid heightened legal, commercial, and cultural visibility, private engagement exemplifies centuries of deliberate, reflective human interaction. The plant persists quietly, threading through domestic, communal, and cultural contexts alike. Economic and commercial frameworks in the 2020s reflect careful adaptation. Markets emphasize quality control, product consistency, and responsible use. Consumers benefit from accurate labeling, detailed information, and educational initiatives. These structures echo historical patterns of careful measurement and deliberate integration. Meanwhile, private, reflective use continues quietly, demonstrating a seamless coexistence of modern commercial frameworks with centuries-old personal and cultural practices. Social continuity is evident across communities and generational groups. Individuals and groups maintain traditions of measured experimentation, creative engagement, and reflective consumption. Cannabis's effects remain subtle, context-sensitive, and historically consistent. Despite growing visibility, legalization, and commercialization, the patterns of private and communal engagement demonstrate remarkable continuity, echoing centuries of subtle, reflective human interaction. Medical and scientific research continues to refine understanding. Studies explore cannabinoid interactions, strain-specific effects, and patient-centered outcomes. Observations consistently emphasize incremental improvements, subtle relief, and context-dependent benefits. These findings reinforce historical patterns. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but reliably provides quiet benefit in thoughtful, controlled application. Cultural continuity is maintained across regions and contexts. Traditional practices persist alongside modern creative and social engagement. Private and communal use demonstrates historical consistency, integrating cannabis into daily life, creative work, and reflective practices. The plant operates simultaneously as a culturally embedded tool and a modern regulated commodity, bridging centuries of continuity with contemporary adaptation. Private use remains calm, deliberate, and historically grounded. Individuals and communities maintain patterns of measured experimentation, creative engagement, and reflective consumption. Its effects are subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Even amid heightened legal, commercial, and cultural visibility, private engagement exemplifies centuries of deliberate, reflective human interaction. The plant persists quietly, threading through domestic, communal, and cultural contexts alike. Global patterns demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Diverse legal, cultural, and social contexts coexist with consistent human engagement. Traditional practices persist, creative experimentation continues, and measured personal use remains stable. Cannabis demonstrates resilience across centuries, continents, and cultural contexts, reflecting a quiet but persistent continuity in human life. Medical and scientific research reinforces historical adaptation. Studies continue to explore nuanced therapeutic applications, cannabinoid interactions, and context-dependent effects. Observations consistently emphasize incremental improvements, subtle relief, and context-dependent benefits. These findings align with historical human experience. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but reliably provides quiet benefit in thoughtful, controlled application. Cultural continuity in the 2020s illustrates a delicate balance between continuity and adaptation. Legal, commercial, and scientific frameworks coexist with centuries-old practices of private use, ritual, and creative engagement. Cannabis demonstrates resilience, subtlety, and enduring relevance across diverse social, cultural, and regulatory landscapes.
Social and cultural engagement maintains historical continuity. Individuals continue reflective, measured use in private, creative, and communal contexts. Effects remain subtle, context-dependent, and historically consistent. Even amid heightened visibility, legal reform, and commercial expansion, private engagement demonstrates centuries of deliberate, reflective human interaction with the plant. Cannabis continues to occupy its dual identity. It serves as both a culturally embedded tool for reflection, creativity, and ritual, and a regulated commodity adapted to contemporary markets. This duality highlights adaptability, subtle persistence, and enduring relevance across centuries, cultures, and legal frameworks. Despite commercialization, legalization, and public attention, personal and cultural engagement remains historically consistent. Individuals continue reflective, subtle use for creativity, contemplation, mild relaxation, and therapeutic support. Its effects remain nuanced, context-dependent, and historically grounded. Cannabis persists quietly, threading centuries of human experience into the modern era. Through the 2020s, cannabis exemplifies the slow, persistent rhythms of human engagement. It bridges past and present, traditional and modern, domestic and public. Its subtle effects, historical continuity, and cultural adaptability illustrate enduring patterns of curiosity, measured experimentation, and reflective use across millennia. Quiet,
Resilient and adaptive, cannabis endures in the 2020s as it has for centuries. It embodies centuries of human curiosity, careful integration, and reflective engagement. Across medical, cultural, social, and economic contexts, it remains a gentle, adaptive companion to human life, quietly threading through history while navigating modern realities. Human engagement with cannabis continues to demonstrate centuries-long continuity. Thoughtful experimentation, creative facilitation, and subtle reflection persist across generations, geographies, and legal frameworks. Its presence reinforces centuries of measured, reflective, and adaptive human interaction, maintaining a calm, quiet, and historically grounded role in daily life. Cannabis in the modern era remains an enduring companion to reflection, creativity, social cohesion, and mild therapeutic support. Its effects are subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful, mirroring centuries of historical continuity. Across diverse cultural, legal, and social landscapes, it continues to serve as a quietly adaptive, historically grounded element of human life. The plant's persistence underscores the broader pattern of human engagement with substances, subtle, adaptive, reflective, and continuous across generations. Cannabis remains a gentle companion, threading through centuries, cultures, and social systems, quietly maintaining the historical continuity that defines its enduring role in human life. As we move deeper into the 2020s, cannabis continues to occupy a quietly influential space across human societies. The plant, which is threaded through millennia of cultural, medical, and social history, now exists in an era of heightened visibility, regulation, and scientific investigation. Despite these changes, its role in individual and collective human experience remains remarkably consistent, reflective, subtle, and adaptive. Cannabis continues to operate as both a personal tool and a cultural artifact, bridging centuries of historical engagement with modern legal and social frameworks. In North America, legal recreational use has become increasingly normalized. States and provinces that adopted legalization frameworks emphasized structured production, regulated distribution, and clear labeling of cannabinoid content. Dispensaries provide users with access to edibles, tinctures, capsules, and flower products, all subject to quality control and testing. These frameworks encourage careful, measured consumption, echoing centuries of historical practice in which human engagement with cannabis emphasized moderation, reflection, and subtle personal effect. Even as commercialization expands, individual consumption remains primarily private, context-dependent, and integrated into daily routines. Medical research in the 2020s has become increasingly sophisticated. Investigators explore the effects of THC, CBD, and minor cannabinoids in combination with terpenes and other plant constituents. Studies examine chronic pain, neurological disorders, sleep disruption, appetite modulation, and mental health conditions. Researchers emphasize individualized outcomes, documenting subtle improvements rather than dramatic transformations. These findings align with centuries of experiential knowledge. Cannabis rarely produces explosive or uniform effects, but when used thoughtfully, it provides meaningful, context-specific benefits. Globally, legal approaches continue to diverge. Some nations maintain strict prohibition, enforcing punitive measures for possession and use. Others have adopted medical frameworks, decriminalization policies, or full recreational legalization. This uneven landscape illustrates cannabis's remarkable adaptability. In regions of restriction, private use persists quietly, often maintaining traditional practices. In areas of legalization, structured commercial and medical frameworks coexist with private, reflective consumption, demonstrating continuity in both social and individual engagement. Traditional cultural practices continue largely uninterrupted. In India, bhang continues to feature prominently in holy celebrations, religious rituals, and communal gatherings. Caribbean spiritual use maintains its quiet, culturally embedded role in ceremonies and personal reflection. African communities preserve medicinal applications, integrating cannabis into long-standing health practices. These practices underscore the plant's historical resilience and adaptability, demonstrating centuries of subtle, culturally embedded integration. Creative communities continue to integrate cannabis into reflective and contemplative processes. Writers, musicians, visual artists, and thinkers employ the plant thoughtfully, using its effects to enhance focus, perception, collaboration, and introspection. Its influence remains subtle, context-sensitive, and historically consistent, reinforcing the centuries-long pattern of gentle facilitation rather than dramatic transformation. Across creative and intellectual domains, cannabis continues to serve as a quiet companion to reflection, study, and artistry. In social life, cannabis use remains embedded in domestic, communal, and ritual contexts. Individuals and small groups maintain patterns of measured experimentation, integrating cannabis into daily life, creative projects, and mild relaxation. Effects are subtle, nuanced, and personally meaningful, emphasizing reflection and social cohesion. Even in regions of heightened visibility, commercial expansion, or legal regulation, private use demonstrates remarkable continuity with historical practices, reflecting centuries of measured human engagement with the plant. Medical research increasingly emphasizes nuanced, patient-centered applications. Clinical trials explore cannabinoid interactions, strain-specific effects, and individualized dosing. Findings consistently highlight subtle improvements in pain, sleep, cognition, and mood. These observations align with centuries of human experience. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but reliably supports reflection, relaxation, and creative engagement when used thoughtfully. The commercialization of cannabis in the 2020s introduces additional dimensions to its social presence. Licensed dispensaries provide education, accurate product labeling, and guidance on responsible use. Products are developed with attention to consistency, potency, and safety. These frameworks mirror historical patterns of careful measurement and reflective consumption. Despite the increased visibility and commercial attention, private use remains quietly consistent with centuries of practice, reinforcing the plant's subtle, adaptive role. Cultural production reflects the continuity of cannabis's influence. Literature, music, visual arts, and film continue to explore the plant's effects on perception, reflection, and creative collaboration. Artists integrate cannabis thoughtfully into work, using its subtle effects to facilitate dialogue, focus, and contemplation. Across centuries, these patterns of subtle engagement have persisted, demonstrating continuity in human interaction with the plant despite changes in legality, visibility, or cultural context. In private life, cannabis continues to follow historically established patterns. Individuals incorporate it into routines, creative endeavors, meditation, and mild relaxation. Effects remain subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Even amid commercialization, legal reform, and media attention, private engagement exemplifies centuries of deliberate, reflective interaction with the plant. Cannabis continues to thread quietly through domestic, communal, and cultural contexts alike. Economic structures in the 2020s reflect careful adaptation to modern realities. Legal markets emphasize product quality, labeling accuracy, and consumer education. Consumers benefit from detailed information about cannabinoid content, dosing recommendations, and strain-specific effects. These developments echo historical principles of moderation, careful measurement, and reflective use. Meanwhile, personal and cultural engagement persists quietly, illustrating continuity alongside commercial expansion. Social continuity remains strong across diverse communities. Individuals and groups maintain traditions of measured experimentation, creative exploration, and reflective consumption. Effects are subtle, context-sensitive, and historically consistent. Even amid public visibility, legal reform, and commercial growth, private engagement demonstrates centuries of deliberate, reflective human interaction with the plant. Medical research continues to refine understanding of the plant. Investigations explore cannabinoid profiles, strain-specific effects, terpene interactions, and patient-specific outcomes. Findings consistently highlight incremental improvements, subtle therapeutic effects, and context-dependent benefits. Findings reinforce historical patterns. Cannabis is rarely dramatic, but reliably supports reflection, creativity, and mild relief in controlled, thoughtful use.
Cultural continuity remains evident across centuries and regions. Traditional practices, creative engagement, and private experimentation coexist with legal and commercial frameworks. Cannabis operates as both a historically embedded tool and a modern regulated commodity, bridging domestic, communal, and commercial contexts. Its dual identity demonstrates adaptability, subtle persistence, and enduring relevance. Private use maintains centuries-old continuity. Individuals integrate cannabis into daily routines, creative projects, social interactions, and contemplative practices. Effects remain subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Even amid commercialization, legal change, and public attention, personal engagement exemplifies centuries of reflective, measured interaction with the plant. Global trends highlight remarkable resilience. Diverse legal, social, and cultural contexts coexist with consistent patterns of human engagement. Traditional practices persist, creative experimentation continues, and measured personal use remains stable. Cannabis demonstrates adaptability across centuries, continents, and social systems, quietly maintaining continuity in human life. Scientific and medical research reinforces historical insights. Studies continue to explore nuanced therapeutic applications, cannabinoid interactions, and individualized effects. Findings emphasize subtle, context-sensitive benefits rather than dramatic outcomes. This mirrors centuries of human experience. Cannabis supports reflection, mild relief, creativity, and contemplative engagement when used thoughtfully and deliberately. Cultural, social, and medical engagement in the 2020s demonstrates a balance between continuity and adaptation. Legal, commercial, and scientific frameworks coexist with centuries-old private use, ritual practices, and creative engagement. Cannabis continues to demonstrate resilience, subtlety, and enduring relevance across diverse regulatory, cultural, and social landscapes. Social and cultural engagement remains historically grounded. Individuals continue reflective, measured use in private, communal, and creative contexts. Effects remain subtle, context-dependent, and personally meaningful. Even amid visibility, legal reform, and commercial growth, personal engagement preserves centuries of deliberate human interaction with the plant. Cannabis occupies a dual identity in modern society. It is both a culturally embedded instrument for reflection, creativity, and ritual, and a regulated commodity adapted to contemporary markets. This duality highlights subtle persistence, adaptability, and enduring relevance across centuries, regions, and social systems. Despite commercialization, legal visibility, and public attention, personal and cultural use remains historically consistent. Individuals continue measured, reflective engagement for creative exploration, contemplation, mild relaxation, and therapeutic support. Effects are nuanced, context-sensitive, and historically grounded. Cannabis quietly threads centuries of human experience into contemporary life, maintaining continuity across diverse contexts. Through the 2020s, cannabis exemplifies the persistent, measured rhythms of human engagement. It bridges past and present, traditional and modern, domestic and public. Its subtle effects, historical continuity, and cultural adaptation demonstrate enduring patterns of curiosity, reflection, and measured experimentation across millennia. Quiet, resilient, and adaptive, cannabis endures in the modern era as it has for centuries. It embodies centuries of human curiosity, careful integration, and reflective engagement. Across medical, cultural, social, and economic contexts, cannabis remains a subtle, adaptive companion to human life, quietly threading through history while navigating contemporary realities. Human engagement with cannabis continues to demonstrate centuries of continuity. Thoughtful experimentation, creative facilitation, contemplative use, and mild therapeutic application persist across generations, geographies, and regulatory frameworks.
The plant maintains a calm, quiet, historically grounded presence in daily life, illustrating the enduring nature of reflective, measured human interaction. Cannabis in the modern 2020s continues its centuries-long role as a companion to reflection, creativity, social cohesion, and subtle therapeutic support. Its effects are nuanced, context-sensitive, and personally meaningful. Across legal, cultural, and social contexts, it remains quietly adaptive and historically persistent, threading centuries of human experience into the contemporary moment. The plant's persistence highlights a broader pattern of human engagement with psychoactive substances: measured, reflective, adaptive, and continuous. Cannabis exemplifies this pattern, quietly bridging centuries, cultures, and social systems, maintaining continuity while responding to modern social, legal, and scientific realities.